Thank you for joining me for Session 11 in the Lifeway study of the Minor Prophets. This session is on Micah chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. The title is Leaders Needed, and the lesson summary statement is Ungodly Leadership Leads to God's Wrath. At our church, we're in the process of nominating men who will serve as deacons in our church, and so it's a very fitting lesson for us in considering leadership. But in terms of our nation, it's a very fitting lesson to consider in the fact of the midterm elections for 2022. I've written on the board 4 qualifications for leadership: calling, competence, confidence, and character. And I'm going to ask the class, would you rate these between 1 and 4? Which one do you consider to be the most important, second, third, and fourth? And I'm going to have some dialogue with the class that way. It's not as easy as it appears. And I give a little definition of what I'm talking about. For example, with calling, I'm talking about someone who is willing to comply with the will of God, however God is directing them at that time. In competence, you do what you do well. And when it comes to confidence, you're perceived as effective. And then the third is character. That's marked by moral excellence. When it comes to choosing leadership in the church, which of those 4 would you give a number 1 rating and so forth? After that discussion, I'm going to ask them, well, when it came to voting for leadership on a political realm, which of those 4 stands out as the most important? And which do you think is the number 1 choice in terms of people of our nation when it comes to voting? And it might be interesting to see that we might make a different shift when it comes to political leaders than we do spiritual leaders. Maybe not, but it would get us into the lesson. Now respond to the lesson summary statement. It says, ungodly leadership will lead to God's wrath. And I'm wanting the class to tell me, how does that strike them? What is it that stands out about that? When they meditate on that, what comes forth from that? Because the thing that's interesting to me about that statement is there's no wiggle room. There's no concessions. Notice again just the flat, absolute statement. Ungodly leadership will lead to God's wrath. And what I'm wanting to eventually lead the conversation about that lesson summary statement is that the problem with ungodly leaders is they lead people away from following God. And anytime people are diverted or moved away or go in a different direction from God, it always brings destruction. And so the firmness of this statement, I would agree with. Ungodly leadership will lead to God's wrath. On the board, I've also included an outline from Warren Wiersbe in terms of how you could see the development of the book of Micah. Chapters 1 and 2 is a message of warning, and the emphasis seems judgment is coming. Then chapters 3, 4, and 5 are a message of promise, and a deliverer is coming. And then 6 and 7, a message of challenge, trust the Lord now. One of the things that happens in Micah's book is this courtroom scene is a picture that he presents quite a bit, and in terms of bringing an accusation of judgment against God's people for breaking God's law. And you see that in chapters 1 and 2, where God's the judge, and the law of the land is God's law. And both Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem, the capital of the southern kingdom, are on trial. And he says destruction is coming. And why are they being judged? Well, chapter 2, verse 8 through verse 11 gives the reason for it. But then chapter 12 and following give future hope. And you'll see that throughout the book of Micah. He will have these very stern words of judgment. But he'll come back and he'll give a word of hope as well. And so he's speaking in chapters 1 and 2 about judgment. And before you can have a word of hope, sin must be dealt with. It must be exposed. And so in chapter 3, Micah, in his second message, he calls out these corrupt judges and political leaders and religious leaders. So he's exposing sin and he's dealing with sin. And then what will follow is a word of hope. The lesson points are instructive as well. Notice the first point, it talks about self-serving leaders. Now that is a contradiction. According to the teachings of the Scriptures, when it comes to leadership, leaders are put in place in order to serve the people. These people are living in contradiction of what God's Word teaches. They are self-serving leaders. And look at the word corrupt prophets. That's the very opposite of what a prophet is supposed to be. And then the last lesson sums it all up when it says leadership is responsible. The destruction that's come upon the land in the northern kingdom and will be coming upon the land in the southern kingdom, the ones that God lays the responsibility at their feet are the leaders, the political leaders, the civic leaders, the judges, as well as the religious leaders. This is a good word for us as we consider in our church spiritual leadership and for our nation as we consider our political leadership and our judges. So the first point is self-serving leadership. Micah chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. And so let me read through that and ask some questions of you as we go through it. Then I said, "Now listen, leaders of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel." And again, we've talked about this a lot in the teachings of the Old Testament. When he uses the word hear or the word listen, what is it that is the meaning of that? And the idea is obedience. He calls the people, these specific leaders, to make a response of obedience. Then I said, now listen. It is written in the form of a command. This is not an option for them. And he points out leaders of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. And commentators think that he's referring to political leadership as well as judicial leadership. And then he asks this question, aren't you supposed to know what is just? He's reminding them of their responsibilities. They're supposed to know the will of God, and they're supposed to do the will of God and implement the will of God. Aren't you supposed to know what is just? In the original language, the definite article "the" is in front of the word just. Aren't you supposed to know what is the just? And so he's talking about God's justice. And they are to lead the society to implement the righteousness, the fairness, the equality, the justice that God has written in his law. What is a definition of justice? When we talk about justice, what are we talking about? And I hope to get a response from the class about that. And then I came across this idea of justice. Justice is a system that impartially punishes the guilty and protects the innocent according to the laws that are put in place. Justice is a system that impartially punishes the guilty and protects the innocent according to the laws that are put in place. And of course, the laws that are being referred to would be the Word of God. And that is always good. So it's administrating and putting into practice the will of God as found in the Word of God. And these men were not doing that. It says in verse 2, you hate good and you love evil. The tense in which it's written in the original language is continuous. So it's not just an occasional mistake or occasional rejection of God's law or the desire to do evil. This is their lifestyle. This is a pattern of life for these people. And this idea of good is a reference to the will of God. God's will is good. And evil would be anything contrary to the will of God. So they absolutely hate doing the will of God. But what they really love is doing those things that are contrary to the will of God. Now, notice the outcome of that kind of lifestyle. You tear off people's skin and strip their flesh from their bones. You eat the flesh of my people after you strip their skin from them and break their bones. You chop them up like flesh for the cooking pot, like meat in a cauldron. It's shocking language. It's almost cannibalistic language. It was to get the attention of the people. So what is it that Micah is wanting to say? What is he pointing out about these political leaders? And you might want to refer them to their personal study guide on page 103 and see what it has in terms of its expression, what it explains about this expression. And you'll notice that one of the things it talks about is its shock value. Now, what they're doing is they're feeding at the expense of others. They are the exact opposite of what the Torah said the leadership was supposed to be. The leadership was to love God, they were to love their neighbor, and they were to lead in that way. But instead of them loving God, they hate the Word of God, and instead of them loving their neighbors, they are doing evil to their neighbors. These people are not practicing justice. They're self-serving leaders. In verse 4, he says, "Then they will cry out to the Lord, but he will not answer them." It's not that the Lord doesn't hear them. He's simply not going to respond to them. He will hide his face from them at that time. In the Hebrew, the idiom of the face, if you talked about the face towards someone, that was a way of talking about blessing. But if the face is away from someone, that is a response of withholding the blessing or judgment. And he will hide his face from them at that time. There will be the withholding of the blessing. Because, here's the reason why he's withholding the blessing. Because of the crimes they have committed. Since self-serving leadership will lead to God's wrath, then what would selfless leadership do? It would bring God's blessings. And so, in contrast to what we've seen about these self-serving leaders, let's talk about the selfless leader of Jesus. And let's talk about what we see in the life of Jesus that leads people to blessing instead of to wrath. And so what are the things about Jesus that are contradictory of these leaders in the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom? And there's just a whole list of things. For example, greatness. Jesus' definition of greatness, a great leader, is someone who serves others. They don't exalt themselves. Jesus said of himself, "I'm humble and gentle of heart." So humility would be one of the qualities of great leadership, appropriate leadership, godly leadership. There's gentleness. That's the ability to withhold harm when you can respond to someone who has done you wrong. There's harmony and not divisiveness. The man of God is not to be a brawler. There's glorifying God. That seems to be the center of his life. There's Christ-centered living. There's just a number of things that we could list on the board as a description of what these men were supposed to be and what God calls us to be. Because leadership will either lead the people to blessing or leadership will lead people to judgment. And that's how critical leadership is in the church. That's why the church needs to take it so very seriously. Now look at this verse again in verse 4. "Then they'll cry out to the Lord, but he'll not answer them. He will hide his face from them at the time because of the crimes they have committed." So we have sayings in our language that basically say the same thing. The verse is saying when they get into a tight place, then they'll call out to God. But because they've been evil and they've not listened to the people and they've taken advantage of them, God will not answer them. He'll let them experience the judgment of their sin. For example, we have a statement that says, "What goes around comes around." That's in a sense what he's saying in verse 4. What are some other statements we have in our language that conveys that same kind of statement? How about What you sow, you'll reap. Turnabout is fair play. Are there other statements that your class can come up with that conveys what is happening here? Now, the second point is corrupt prophets. Chapter 3, verses 5 to 8. If you heard someone say, well, he is a corrupt preacher, what would you imagine that person is saying about the preacher? He is a corrupt preacher. And I want to get response from the class. Now, this is what Micah is saying about these false prophets. This is his first clash with false prophets. And his statement about them is they are corrupt. Now, these aren't prophets of Baal. These are those who pretend to speak for God. But what we see is they're preachers for hire. They manipulate the message. Look what it says in verse 5. This is what the Lord says. This is another prophecy from Micah. This is what the Lord says concerning the prophets, and you could put in there parentheses, false prophets, who lead my people astray. And that's the reason we know they're false prophets. They lead God's people away from doing and living the Word of God. Who proclaim peace when they have food to sink their teeth into, but declare war against one who puts nothing in their mouths. What is it, class, that they're saying, that Micah is saying about these false preachers? They're leading people astray. And what is one of the ways in which they do that? Well, what he's saying is they pay whatever, they preach whatever message you're willing to pay for. And if you're not willing to pay them, they're not going to speak the word that you want to hear. They're going to speak words of judgment. So they manipulate people, and their message is based on what they get paid. Verse 6, therefore it will be night for you without visions. Now here are prophets. What he's saying is they receive nothing from God. There's no message from God. It will grow dark for you without divination. There's no direction. Divination was the idea of oftentimes a pagan practice where they would take the internal organs of an animal and mess around with that and say, well, here's the message from God. Or they would see the birds fly in a certain way and say, and he's just simply saying they got nothing. They got nothing to offer you. It will grow dark for you without divination. The sun will set on these prophets, and the daylight will turn black over them. The point he's driving at is there's no revelation to share. The people come to these men and they want insight. They want light. They want to know what God has for them. And these men have nothing to give them. Verse 7, then the seers will be ashamed and the diviners disappointed. The very thing that they're supposed to do, share the Word of God, share the will of God. They have nothing. And so they are ashamed by that. They will cover their mouths because there will be no answer from God. The word is literally mustache. But the idea in that society is the people who covered their mouth were lepers. And so it's a shocking statement that Micah is getting at. Here are the preachers of the people. They're to give the Word of God. They have nothing to give because they're not concerned about the Word of God. They're only concerned with filling their pockets with a message that tickles the ears of the people. And so when it comes to giving insight to people, they don't have anything. And what Micah says is they're going to be ashamed. And the way he puts it is the most rejected class in society, the lepers. These men will be like that. And he said there'll be no answer from God. This is the first time in the book of Micah that he uses the word God, the word Elohim. All the time before he used the word Yahweh, which was a word that spoke about relationship. This is a word about power. They have no connection with the real God. So he uses this kind of passage. He says in verse 8, as for me, that is, this is much different. Micah is different. He's in contrast to those men. As for me, however, notice this, I am filled with the power by the Spirit of the Lord. He is controlled. And he's controlled to the point that he has power to effectively speak the Word of God and to live the Word of God. And where is that source coming from? From the Spirit of God. And as a result of that, he speaks with justice and courage. He speaks that which is right and according to God's will, and he speaks it and proclaims it with conviction and confidence. To proclaim to Jacob his rebellion and to Israel his sin. He confronts the people about their sin instead of telling them what they want to hear. Now 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1 is a passage I'd like for a class member to read, and it talks about the false teachers that are among the church. And what that passage says is they will be there. You will have false teachers in the church. And it says that they will be among you. So down through the ages, there have always been, in the midst of God's people, teachers and preachers who do not teach the Word of God. They teach what tickles people's ears, what people are willing to pay for, what people want to hear, instead of telling the people what God's Word actually says. And this is a very serious matter. You see the lesson summary again? Ungodly leadership will lead to God's wrath. So what do you look for to recognize corrupt preachers? And so I'm going to give the class 4 things, and I'm going to ask them to expand on the topics. For example, what we can see from this passage is one of the ways to distinguish a corrupt preacher from a true preacher is the source of the message. Where's the source of his message coming from? So, class, what would be the source of a true prophet? Well, of course, the source would be the Bible. And what would be sources coming from false prophets? Well, it could be any other source that is man-made. And your class could expand on that. A second is the substance of the message. One of the things that the New Testament makes very clear is the substance of the message, the center of the message is Jesus Christ. Now there are faiths out there in which Jesus Christ is not central. And these are very easy to identify. The Jehovah's Witnesses talk about Jesus Christ, but he's not central. The Mormons talk about Jesus Christ, but he's not central. Islam talks about Jesus Christ, but he's not central to their faith. He's on the periphery. And so what are other teachings that they make Jesus important, but he's not central? Anything that distracts or diverts from the teachings of Jesus Christ is a substance of a message that is wrong, and it will lead to God's wrath. So there's the source of the message, substance of the message. And then another thing I believe we see in this passage is the character produced. What kind of person is produced? Now, these false teachers were producing selfish people, people who only wanted what they were. They were willing to be unjust to the poor and the disadvantaged. What is produced in these messages? Is it people filled with the Spirit, people of kindness and goodness and gentleness that reflect the character of Christ? Or is it something that produces harshness and pride? Those are things you could talk about. And then the fourth thing is, what's the outcome for the person? If the person continues on this path, what would be the outcome? My wife and I have watched a series on television that is about a young woman. She has a deep issue she's dealing with, and the series hasn't revealed what that is, but she's seeking help. She goes to an uncle who is a Roman Catholic, and he tries to help her find help and forgiveness through his Catholic practices, but it doesn't work for her. And then she turns to a paganism, and she tries to find help there, but it doesn't work for her. And the outcome so far in the series is she takes her life. Well, that's showing you. What I said to my wife, what was interesting was she never rejected spirituality. She knew that it had to be something outside of her that granted this forgiveness. But what is the outcome when you follow these things? Is it heaven or is it hell? Is it war or is it peace? The church needs protected from false prophets. And the front line for the church are the preachers. And a corrupted preacher is not there, and he will not protect his flock. The third point that I want you to see is responsibility declared. Chapter 3, verses 9 through 12. Listen to this. Again, we go back to that word listen, and he's wanting them to obey. Listen to this, leaders of the house of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel. So we're talking about the civic leaders who abhor justice and pervert everything that is right. The word abhor is a strong word. It has about it the idea of loathing the justice of God. It's repugnant to them. They detest it. And then as a result of that attitude, they pervert everything. That is, they twist it. They take that which is good and they make it something that is bad. God has given us good appetites like thirst, and people take that and become alcoholics. We have desire for food and we become gluttons. We have the desire for sex. This is from God, and we become adulterous. And so they lead people to pervert these things. They pervert everything that is right. And notice, who build Zion with bloodshed. It's actually a plural. And so it's talking about much blood, and it's talking about murder. And Jerusalem with injustice. Her leaders issue rulings for a bribe. Her priests teach for a payment. Her prophets practice divination for silver. You see, they're all in on it. They're all in on it for the money. Yet they lean on the Lord, saying, isn't the Lord among us? No disaster will overtake us. They're just deceiving themselves. And then he tells them plain in verse 12, all this has happened because of you. Now imagine that statement. All this has happened because of you. Think of saying to the preachers of America, the condition of our nation is your fault, not Washington, D.C.'s. It's the pulpit's fault. That's in a sense what he's saying. And he does throw in Washington, D.C. in here, I might add. Verse 12, therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become ruins, and the temple's mount will be a high thicket. Something is plowed. That's a picture of the old and no longer exists. And this idea of a high thicket was a picture of a place of pagan. He is saying that where the temple's at, that's going to be a place of pagan worship. If you go to Jerusalem, there on the Temple Mount is not the temple. It is the Dome of the Rock, one of the high holy places of Islam. That would be fitting into this statement of a high thicket, a place of pagan worship. And there they worship the false god of Allah. I've got an odd question for you as we're beginning to wrap up the lesson. Where do you go where they encourage you to prepare yourself for Judgment Day? Now hear that question again, because it's an important question. Where do you go where the people will encourage you to prepare yourself for Judgment Day? That day's coming. And that day should have an impact and influence on our life. Where do you go where people help you prepare for that day? The only place I know that people go and they help you get prepared for that day is the church. That's how important the church is. Maybe the reason for the state of our nation and the state of our community is the people in our nation and the people in our communities aren't going to church. And when they do go to church, maybe the churches they're going to are not preparing them for that day of judgment, because they don't speak to them about sin and they don't speak to them about responsibility. And on page 108 in the personal study guide, there is a series of 3 questions. And I'm going to ask these 3 questions as we close out the lesson. The questions are simply this. Discuss as a group how believers can stand for God's truth in today's world. Discuss as a group how believers can stand for God's truth in today's world. The second statement is, what role does the group play in making sure believers understand God's truth? I have a role as the teacher and preacher, but what is the group's role in helping? And last of all, how can the group encourage each other to stand for God's truth? What a lesson. What a timely lesson for our day. Thank you for teaching God's Word. God bless.